Lisa? Okay. Good morning and thanks for joining us this morning for this How to Lobby webinar. I'm Lori Ponce. I'm director of the Coalition for a Strong Nebraska. We have two wonderful panelists with us this morning to share what they know about lobbying and how it affects nonprofits and what you need to know before you engage in such advocacy. We're joined this morning by Weston Miller, who's Director of Public Policy at Civic Nebraska. And he's going to be sharing with us an overview of lobbying, what it is, how to track your lobbying, what it looks like for nonprofits. And so we're excited to hear about that. And we're also joined by Tiffany Yackel, Research and Policy Director of the Women's Fund of Omaha. And first, we are going to hear from Tiffany, who's going to tell us about some background on how to create a policy platform for your organization. So let's go ahead and start. I also wanted to introduce Lisa Sock, who is helping the Coalition for a Strong Nebraska out. She will be moderating Q&A, so don't hesitate to enter your questions if you have them, and they will be asked of the panelists. So let's take it away, Tiffany. Thank you.
Good morning, all. I'm really glad to be here with you. Can everyone see a slide deck that I'm trying to share? Yeah, okay. As I said on a presentation earlier this week, despite being on Zoom for what feels like 87 years, I still haven't quite figured out all the tips and tricks. So I'm Tiffany Yackel. I'm Research and Policy Director at the Women's Fund of Omaha. For those of you who are not familiar with the Women's Fund, we work on the most critical issues facing women and girls by identifying issues through research, funding solutions, through grants to local nonprofits, and leading change by advocating for effective public policy solutions. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the Women's Fund engagement in advocacy. We haven't always done advocacy and have really grown the advocacy work over the last just a little less than a decade, and want to be clear that I have only been with the Women's Fund since 2018. So much of this work was done before me and by colleagues that have come before. So want to give them all the credit for growing our work in this space. So I will talk a little bit about how advocacy looked when we had 3 staff and how it looks today when we have 14. We have grown tremendously over the last decade or so, and our advocacy has as well and has really been intertwined with all of the growth and all of our staff. And I'll talk about how we did that. For those of you who are in early stages of advocacy work, I'll give a few sort of basics about what is really important to know, and then things for you to consider as you grow and move your advocacy work forward. So that's what I hope to talk about today, and then turn it over to Weston to let him give you all the skills. So the Women's Fund began our advocacy journey in 2013. It was in the interest of the board and our executive director at the time, Michelle Zeke, who you'll hear me refer to a lot. They added advocacy to our strategic plan. And at the time, our board had a couple of folks who had some engagement and some expertise in policy advocacy, but pretty minimal. So we began down that road by Michelle, our ED, brought in folks, advocates who could present to the board and help them understand why it was important to achieving our mission, how we could do it, right? Like many nonprofits and many board members of nonprofits, there's this belief that nonprofits cannot lobby. And if you take nothing else away from my presentation today, it is that in all caps, underlined, highlighted, nonprofits can lobby. The Women's Fund of Omaha is a nonprofit. I believe Weston at Civic is a nonprofit. Voices for Children in Nebraska is a nonprofit. ACLU of Nebraska is a nonprofit. All of these organizations that you know that do advocacy are nonprofits. we simply have to monitor, and there's a limit to the advocacy work that we can do. And so we just need to be mindful of those limits. So I'll talk a little bit about that, but helping our board understand, that we are not going to be able to create opportunities for women and girls without changing the systems that have been built to withhold opportunities from women and girls, and specifically, and in many cases, particularly women and girls of color. So educating our board that policy is critical to our mission, right? We can't just fund our way to opportunity. We have to change systems. Our board jumped on board and was very excited about it. So in the second year of the work, the next evolution was that we created a policy committee, and that recognizing that we didn't have the expertise on staff or on our board to lead an advocacy agenda, we brought in folks from outside. So this policy committee included board members, but it also included advocates, seasoned advocates, experts. Many sheroes of mine served on the policy committee to help guide and inform the advocacy work of the organization. So that policy committee helped us then in the next year create a very limited agenda. We took on 3 issues at the time, and we thought about it in a way of what is something that maybe we can win, right? So we picked an issue that we thought was low-hanging fruit at the time. We also picked an issue that was sort of central and core to our mission. We weren't sure how successful we'd be, but we felt like not using our voice on that issue would be glaringly problematic, right? So low-hanging fruit, something central to our mission. And then we picked something that was a reach that we thought, this is a way to dip our toe in, and we can continue to work on this for years to come. In doing that, we still were not, it was our executive director doing all of the lobbying, right? So it was Michelle Zeke writing the testimony and testifying at hearings, engaging with legislators. But what I think is really important to know in that early stage is that we leaned heavily on partners and collaborators, and that policy committee included folks who had been doing this work and could really guide Michelle so that she knew in her limited time that she had to commit to this work, what was the most impactful and useful ways to use her voice and use the voice and the network of the Women's Fund. We similarly partnered with other advocacy organizations on those issues, so we could watch them do it, we could learn from them, we could offer what we could that was unique to us in supporting them in really carrying most of the advocacy work. So that was 2015. We found it very successful. Our board was very excited. And so that led to, in the next year, we hired a full-time policy staff. So that was 2016. She led the work for a couple of years, worked with some amazing collaborators to grow the work of that organization. Until today, we are staffed. So we staff the policy work. It's led by me, the research and policy director. We have really integrated the advocacy work into all of our issue areas. So it's not just me doing the testifying, it's all of our program staff that are experts in these spaces. And one thing I think is important to share is that I know there can be a hesitancy to engage in advocacy for some groups because it can be deemed controversial, or people can worry about, losing supporters. And what I will tell you is that we did a strategic planning recently in the last couple of years, and over 80% of our community, so that includes funders, supporters, collaborators, board members, over 80% of the people that were surveyed that are connected with the Women's Fund recognized advocacy as a key strategy to achieve our mission. The majority of our funders, over 50% of our funders, responded that they look to advocacy outcomes as a measure of our success in achieving our mission. And it led our evaluators to conclude, quote, policy is the future. Increased policy work and legislative presence was consistently mentioned as something going really well and a focal area for the future. So I only mention that if that gives you any sort of peace of mind about worrying about losing support. I think we have only gained it because we've become more visible in this space. And I think particularly in the time that we are in, there is an increased and growing recognition of systemic barriers, and the need to remove systemic barriers for opportunity will require system change, legislative change, statutory change. So advocacy is now central to everything we do at the Women's Fund. I'll talk a little bit about how we develop our agenda. This will be different depending upon where you are in your advocacy journey, but I just want to give you some things to think about. And it will be different than the way we do it now, just because we do have a fairly well-developed advocacy program. But generally, the way we start is we begin with our experts, right? So the Women's Fund works in 3 areas: freedom from violence, sexual literacy and reproductive health, and then economic stability and women's leadership. In those areas, we have program staff that work directly with coalitions, with grantees. And so we are actively engaging those folks who are on the ground and working with community members to determine what are the biggest challenges that you're seeing. I ask my colleagues, if you were queens of the world, what would you change to accomplish our mission? And then it's sort of my job to formulate that, what in that is a policy solution. So for those of you who are new to this work, or maybe don't do advocacy, but do a lot of direct service and have great relationships in the community, think about engaging with your program staff, think about engaging directly with community members, and asking or brainstorming or just being mindful of the barriers that continue to come up again and again, and how can those be addressed in a systemic way rather than family by family, person by person. I think you can look around and work on policy with your existing partners. So if you have identified these barriers that you continue to come up against, or this opportunity that you think if you could change this one thing, this would make such a difference for your families and the folks that you work with, who else is probably, what other organizations are probably running up against that barrier as well? You likely work in coalition with a number of organizations. So can you begin to engage them to think about how you all can move and change this structure and system together? And I think, again, here I would lift up the important part about you don't have to do this from scratch. You don't have to overnight become an expert lobbyist and know all the things that Weston's going to tell you. There are lots of advocacy organizations that work in this world that are happy to support you. And I can say, even if I don't have the policy expertise or it's not an area that the Women's Fund works, I believe strongly in supporting other organizations and engaging in systems change and statutory change. So my door is always open. Well, not in COVID, I suppose. My email is always open. You please call me and ask. I feel strongly about supporting others in this work. I think we need more voices at the legislature moving these systems. And so reach out to us. We're here to help and support. And then I think you want to start with research. So what do we know about the problem and what do we know about the solution that we're proposing? So as you begin to engage in this work, these will be the questions, right? Do other states have this thing that you're proposing? Tell me how this, so the barrier that you're coming across, is it just one family? Is it all the families that you're serving? Is it community wide? Is it in certain zip codes, right? Like just be prepared to sort of develop an explanation of the problem and how your proposed solution begins to address that. That can also be thinking about, it doesn't have to be like academic research. It can be lived experience is as important, if not more important than academic research. We know there are many barriers and voices to not being lifted up in peer-reviewed research. And so storytelling, client stories, community stories are just as important to that research as are the facts and figures. And that's something that many of your organizations can contribute to the advocacy effort, even if you aren't the ones doing the direct lobbying, right? So maybe you can't be down at in Lincoln every day, like a number of us or some of us, but you can support those that are by lifting up the stories and the data that your organization has about the problem. Some things that I think are important to consider as you engage in creating a platform, mission alignment. So I would say that, in that first year when the Women's Fund engaged in 3 issues, people wanted to pull us into a lot more, right? There are so few groups doing this kind of work, the advocacy work, that once you kind of dip your toe in, people want you to be involved in just about everything. So we were really trying to be strategic about only doing what we knew we could do well and what we offered something unique to. So think about that. How does this relate to our mission, vision, and values? How does this align with our current priorities, right? So for the Women's Fund, women and girls are impacted by, quite frankly, most policies. We can't do everything. And so how do we prioritize? And that's an important thing to consider internally. Thinking about what role you can play. At the Women's Fund, we're always thinking, is our voice necessary and is it helpful? Honestly, there will be times when us weighing in may not be the most impactful or helpful thing to the conversation. So what can we contribute? We are lucky and privileged to have organizational resources that we can devote to lobbying and advocacy, but maybe you aren't in that spot. So could you give funding to help another group do it? Could you help manage a coalition? Could you provide research data information? Could you bring your people together, your listserv, offer to host a public education session? Can you lift up community stories? These are all things that are important that don't look directly like lobbying. Who else can we bring to the table? Who's not at the table? What relationships do we have that we can offer? And that can be community relationships. It can be client relationships. It also, think about your board members, grass tops leaders in the community. They can be really impactful and can often get a call into a senator in a way that not everyone can. What's our level of commitment? How do we ensure sufficient capacity that we can do this work? And then think, who will be on the other side of the issue and how are we prepared to navigate their opposition? I want to be here to tell you that none of these things should be a barrier to you not getting involved at all. So I'm not here to give you a way out. I think all of these challenges can be overcome. I just think they're important things for you to think about as you develop how and on what issues you're going to engage. So there's some additional questions that I think are really important and really are foundational. Thinking about your policy work, who's being centered and who does it leave out? Have you considered all the intersections in the policy solution that you propose? So perhaps this will work really well for one group, but the way it impacts another is not helpful, right? So how are you evaluating that? Whose voices are you bringing in to inform the work that you're doing? Do diverse lived experiences support this work? Are we giving space and listening to people who may have a different perspective or be seated in different positions than us? Are we actively looking for what we do not know and who or what ideas are missing from the table? And then, one thing that we try to think about a lot is how are we sharing the advocacy space and the privilege and resources that we have at the Women's Fund to help support others who may not have access to those same resources and privileges? How are we providing a safe space for marginalized voices to speak out? What are we doing to decenter the Women's Fund and make advocacy available to everyone who wants to engage? So I'm sort of flying through this because I feel like I'm already over time, but you will get these slides, you will have these questions. I will say that this is not something that the Women's Fund has always done well. I want to be honest and transparent about that. But we, moving forward, these sorts of questions will be central to how we determine what kinds of issues we will take action on. So some quick basics, get your board on board. We talked about that already. There are ways to do that. Bring in Weston to present, bring in Lori to present. Quite frankly, the Women's Fund got started in this, or one of the ways we got started was I was working for the Coalition for a Strong Nebraska at the time, and Michelle brought me in to speak to her board. So it's a great jumping off point. Again, nonprofits can lobby, but advocacy is broader than lobbying. Lobbying is a direct ask to an elected official regarding specific legislation and asking them to take a position, right? It's a very specific way to advocate, but advocacy can also be educating the public about an issue. If you care about access to safe and affordable housing and you talk about the barriers to that, as long as you're not saying support legislative bill 10, that's not lobbying. If you're educating about issues, that is not lobbying. Research. So you write a report, you bring all the information your organization has to bear about barriers to safe and affordable housing. That's not lobbying. There's lots of things that you can do that are not lobbying that are helpful to the broader cause. And then familiarize yourself with laws. So there is the 501H election, which Lori has plenty of resources about at the coalition, but it makes lobbying easier for to track and feel confident that you're safely under the limits. Be careful around elections. This is where most nonprofits, if they get in trouble, they get in trouble around elections. So I've got a link in there to think about. And then when in doubt, call Alliance for Justice. There's an 800 number on the bottom. I call them at least once every couple of months. They are wonderful and they will answer any questions you have about making sure you're in compliance with the law in your advocacy. A couple of entry points. Join CSN, stay involved. That's a way to learn the lingo, learn the movement, learn who's involved, follow other advocacy organizations, join their email list, follow them on social media. If you think that you have an issue that they work on, call them, call me and say, this is a barrier we keep coming up against. I'd like to work on it. Can you help me connect to the right people? I'm happy to do that. Lori's happy to do that. There's a resource on the legislative website called Bill Tracker that allows you to track 15 bills every session. So if you wonder, like, I like this bill or I hate this bill, I don't know how to know what's happening, Bill Tracker is a great resource and that's linked here. And then build relationships with your elected officials. They're normal people who exist in their community. They want to know what's going on in their community. Invite them to coffee. Tell them about the work that you do. Tell them about the great things you do for your community. Tell them about where your community needs additional assistance, and legislative policy can be the way to do it. It's easy, it's low barrier. It seems scary, but it's really not. Reach out, and then that will benefit you in the long run when you need something, right? When you need to call them later and say, we love this bill, can you please support it? Remember, we met, you toured our facility, you met with some clients. It's a really impactful, sort of easy way to start the process. So there's my contact information. I'll hang around. I'm sorry I took more time than I was given. Okay.
No, that was incredible information, Tiffany. Thank you so much. I don't know if we have any questions, but I have a question for you. What do you do? It's so easy to politicize the issues that we work on. How do you stay away from that when you're talking with your board or your staff? How do you keep, when maybe the other side is trying to politicize an issue, how do you keep that out of the conversation and stay on issue?
I think we can do that because there are no issues that we work on because I like them, right? Politically, they seem fun. The issues that we work on, we pick them because we have research, data, experience, expertise to support that this is what will be impactful for women and girls in this space, in this moment. So many of our issues are politicized. There's no doubt about that. And it's really impossible to sort of avoid. But I have no problem with a straight face coming to any senator of any political party, partisan stripe or not, and making the case for the issue that I care about because it supports our mission, because it's what women and girls need. And so when I can lean heavily on the background research that we've done to just get there, I have no problem. And I try to support my board and all of our team in doing that as well. I would also say personal stories are really helpful there, right? So if I can lift up a client story that, or, you know, a way that this impacts a real person in the community, that can also diffuse some of that political nature.
Okay. And can you tell me what was the low-hanging fruit that you first went for?
Oh, it's embarrassing because we didn't even get that low-hanging fruit. It was increasing the child independent care tax credit, the refundable portion of the child independent care tax credit. We thought, oh, no problem, that's super easy. Kate Bowles is going to do it. We'll get it. We didn't get it done. The central to our mission was childcare assistance, expanding childcare subsidy, which we finally did. That was 2013. It's 2021, but we finally did that this session. And then the reach was the family planning waiver for Medicaid, which we still have not done. So here we go.
Yeah, we're so lucky to have Tiffany on the side of women and girls. She's an incredible force who's well respected, and it takes work to get there. And so we're just grateful that we have her on our side and as a mentor. And so I strongly encourage anyone to reach out to Tiffany with any questions you might have in the advocacy you do. So thank you, Tiffany. That was a great presentation. I learned a lot. So let's move on to Weston. Now that we know what you may want to lobby on, what does that look like? What do you need to know in order to engage? So Weston, go ahead and take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Laurie. And thanks, Tiffany. That was great as usual. Let me pull up my slides here. I'm Weston Miller. I'm the Director of Public Policy with Civic Nebraska. Civic Nebraska is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and our mission is that we are committed to creating a more modern and robust democracy for all Nebraskans. For us, that takes on a couple of different forms. And I'm going to, pause here and make sure my slides are up. Play from start. And Lori and Tiffany, I could only see you. Could you give me a nod if you can see these slides? Excellent. Thank you. I can't actually see the attendees, so if they hate it, I'm not going to know. So yeah, our mission is to create a more modern and robust democracy for all Nebraskans. Civic Nebraska is a cool organization to work for a lot of reasons, but one of which is that we sort of span the spectrum from very political to not political at all in terms of our work. The bulk of our work is actually in after-school programs, working with kids. There's nothing political about it. Obviously, my job exists primarily in the Capitol, very political, working on elections and voting rights legislation all of the time. So basically, what I was asked to do is sort of take Tiffany's advocacy slide there and just kind of dive even deeper into the actual mechanics of what it is we're being asked to do. And Tiffany did cover, I think, lesson number one, which is nonprofits can lobby. We know that. I think if you're here on this webinar, you probably know that. I think CSN does such a good job dispelling that myth at every turn. But once we know that, once we know nonprofits can't lobby, there's kind of a vague, okay, but now what sort of situation. We know we can lobby, but what does that mean? Are there limits? What actually is lobbying? I'm not really clear. And what does it mean to do that in an acceptable way for a nonprofit? So that's what I'm going to dive into. At the end, we'll kind of talk about maybe some tactical kind of things, but it's going to be more kind of broad philosophy than anything. But we're going to talk about the actual, some definitions, some requirements, some structures, because I think one of the most intimidating parts of lobbying is just figuring out the rules in the first place. So that's why I'm here, to help us figure out whether or not it's really that complicated. To do that, we are going to use a fake campaign, and we're going to figure out what we need to know in order to lobby on this campaign. So this is a campaign that I wish I was a part of, and that is Weston's campaign to make bunnies the state animal. I'm a proud rabbit dad, and we're going to do some evangelism about why bunnies are so great and why our lawmakers should get fired up about it. So let's get started. So first, we need to clarify that as a team here today, we have to assume that we are an actual 501c3 nonprofit, right? We're not a loose coalition or not a bunch of volunteers. We are an actual filed nonprofit with paid staff, because sort of the whole structure here is all about measuring your expenditures. So if there's no money involved, then you can kind of skip this webinar. But if there is, if you're an actual 501c3, then these are the rules that we're going to need to know. So as an organization, which we have not yet named, I forgot, Our goal is that we're going to lobby the legislature to make rabbits the state animal. So in order to do that, we need to know a couple of things to make sure that we're following the rules, to make sure we don't get audited, to make sure that we can continue to ask for donations in the future. So there are two essential things, or two big questions, I guess, that we need to answer. Number one, what the heck is lobbying? And then number two, how much can we do it? Are there limits? There are no big reveals in this presentation, so I have put the answers on this slide. Lobbying is influencing legislation. That's the IRS definition. How much can you lobby? You can lobby a lot more than you think, almost guaranteed. So we're going to dive into those two pieces. So if lobbying is influencing legislation, it then follows what the heck is legislation. This is a definition. I forgot to cite my slides here, but everything I have either comes directly from the IRS's website or from the Alliance for Justice, which is the experts that Tiffany recommended. They are the pros. They have all of the answers. And whenever I get confused, I have a binder of all their stuff. And if my binder is incomplete, I just call them, and that's how it goes. So I'm just going to read this really quickly, but the official definition of legislation includes any action by Congress, any state legislature, any local council, or similar governing body with respect to acts, bills, resolutions, or similar items, or, and we'll pause there, second category, by the public in referendum, ballot initiative, constitutional amendment, or similar procedure. It usually does not include actions by executive, judicial, or administrative bodies. So, two things to flag, and this will all get repeated, don't worry. We're generally only talking about lawmaking bodies, but in the case of ballot initiatives, then voters become the lawmaking body. It usually does not include actions by executive, judicial, or administrative bodies. I wanted to go ahead and point out here that an important but frustrating point, which is all of these things have exceptions all of the time. Everything that I'm telling you, you can assume is true most of the time, but it's definitely not true all of the time. And there's always exceptions. And, we've got a lot of experts in this state who can certainly help you kind of figure out in a specific instance what is and is not okay. A very relevant example from my work is the governor versus the secretary of state within the executive branch. Obviously, I work on elections and voting. The secretary of state is the chief elections official, so I spend a ton of time working with that office. And I don't report any of it as lobbying because we're talking about overall attitudes, we're talking about administrative changes. So I do not, I lobby the secretary of state, or I encourage them to take actions all of the time, but they're not lawmakers. I don't report that. The governor is different, particularly when it comes to vetoes or signing bills. If you are lobbying the governor to veto a bill or to sign a bill, that is close enough to the legislative process that the IRS would like you to report it. There are other governor functions that are kind of more like symbolic, you don't have to worry about. But if I interact with the governor's office, I report it just to be safe, whereas I don't with the secretary of state. So there's another example. We'll find plenty of more exceptions as we go through these slides, but that's the general rule. So we know what legislation is, but again, the IRS's definition is that lobbying is influencing legislation. So what the heck does that mean? And this comes directly from the IRS. They say an organization will be regarded as attempting to influence legislation if it contacts or urges the public to contact members or employees of a legislative body. So we'll take that to mean lawmakers or staff, for the purposes of proposing, supporting, or opposing legislation, or if the organization advocates the adoption or rejection of legislation. That's kind of jargony, so I've made it into a list. So to count as lobbying, you have to do three things, and you have to be doing all three of them. If you're doing two of the three, congratulations, it's not lobbying. You don't have to report it. So number one, talking to a lawmaker or their staff, or in the case of a ballot initiative, you're talking to pretty much anybody, to take a specific action on a specific piece of legislation. So on our quest to make bunnies the state animal, let's use an example. Senator Groney, please vote yes on LB 100, a bill making rabbits the state animal. So let's take 20 seconds and see if you can kind of break down those pieces that would define this as lobbying. For member of a lawmaking body to take an action on specific legislation. Do not be distracted by the cute photos, or do. It's up to you. All right, so pretty straightforward. We've got Senator Groney, member of a lawmaking body. We're asking him to please vote yes. That's a specific action on LB 100, a bill making rabbits the state animal, specific piece of legislation. So because all three of those things are there, it's lobbying. If you were to ask Senator Groney how he felt about LB 100, nope, not lobbying, because you're not asking him to do anything. If you are asking Senator Groney to generally support pro-rabbit legislation, that's kind of a gray area. I would probably report it just to be safe, but it doesn't fit this like strict definition. But in this case, we have all three, so we've got to report it. What would not be lobbying is what Tiffany referred to earlier as education. Senator Groney, rabbits are the best. They're soft. They don't bark. Please love them. That is not lobbying, because we have a lawmaker, but we don't have a specific action. We don't have a specific piece of legislation. So in this case, you are just doing general pro-rabbit education, which is worthy work, but not lobbying. Really quickly on the ballot initiative side. So again, remember, this is all the same rules, but now the legislation becomes a petition or an initiative, and the lawmakers become citizens. So if you say, hey, Mike, please sign my petition to make bunnies the state animal, absolutely lobbying, you've got to report it. We have individual, specific action, specific legislation. Whereas, hey, Mike, check out this picture of a rabbit looking like a loaf of bread. Isn't it cute? I wish they were the state animal. Not lobbying, because there's no specific action. I mean, beyond look at this photo, and there's no legislation. So that's a lot of words. I'm going to pause there for a second. I'm not even close to done, but I want to pause there for questions about the lobbying, not lobbying situation. Anybody have a burning question? And if not, we can come back to all of this at the end. I'll pause for just a second because I can't see anybody.
There aren't any questions yet in the chat box. I'll keep you posted if they are.
Then we will just power through.
Thanks, Weston.
Okay, so we tackled the first big question, what is lobbying? The second question, how much can you lobby? Because obviously there's going to be some kind of a limitation. Otherwise, why are we filing this in the first place? And I want to start with an important reminder, which again, this is only for actual 501c3s that are recognized by the IRS with paid folks acting on their behalf. As a resident of the state, you can do whatever you want, whenever you want, like within the confines of the law. So you don't have, individuals can call their senators as often as they want. And that is not a thing you ever have to worry about reporting or anything like that. This is only for organizations with paid staff. This is all about tracking the money that kind of flows through the political process. So just as a reminder. For most of this nation's history, since we've had nonprofits, it was incredibly vague. This passage here actually still exists in the law. It's called the substantial part test. I want you to read it so you can know you should run away from it whenever you see it, because it's confusing and very unhelpful. But it used to be all that there was, which was to say that you can qualify for C3 status if a substantial part of its activities is attempting to influence legislation, commonly known as lobbying. That obviously resulted in lots of questions like, what is substantial? What is activity? Why is this so hard? So finally, decades ago now, they changed the rules and made it much better. We now take what is called the 501H election, which is a very simple one-page form that will make your life so much better if you're a 501c3 engaging in lobbying. I've put the language for 501H here. And it's an expenditure test. So the whole idea is to just measure how much money you're spending. And if you stay under a certain threshold, what do they phrase it as? Do not normally exceed an amount specified in section 4911, then you're good to go. What is section 4911? What does it say? Don't worry, I've got it for you right here. So if your annual expenditures as an organization are $500,000 a year or less, which I think is most of us, your lobbying limit is 20% of your organization's expenditures, period. Every C3 in the country has a hard cap of $1 million, but you'd have to have a really enormous budget to make that work. If your organization spends more than $500,000 a year and you have questions, I have the whole chart, I can send it to you, but I think most members, this is $500,000 or less, 20% of your expenditures creates your lobbying limit. I'll remind you several times in the next few minutes that the IRS does not care at all what your budget is. So if you raised $20 million, congratulations, the IRS only cares what you spent. So if you raise $20 million and you spend $500,000, then your lobbying limit is whatever you spent times 20%. So in this case, $100,000. IRS does not care about your budget. They only care about how many dollars you spent. This is important for a ton of reasons, the biggest of which is just simplicity. The definitions of your limit are very, very clear. Budgeting is much easier. You also get access to a lot of kind of education exemptions, which is, I think, sort of beyond the scope of today. But if you have questions about that, happy to talk about it. It also means volunteer time doesn't count. This is about measuring the flow of money through your organization. So if you have bona fide volunteers who are like, I am fired up about voter ID, I'm going to go tell Senator so-and-so this is a terrible bill, that is not lobbying that I have to report. Now, if I created materials or branded t-shirts for that volunteer to take to the Capitol, I have to report my time creating those materials because that's used for lobbying, but we don't have to worry at all about bona fide volunteers spending their time engaging in lobbying, which makes this a lot easier to track for a lot of organizations. The last thing it means is you will have to distinguish between direct and grassroots lobbying, and that becomes the most confusing part, so I'm saving it for the very end, but we're going to come back to that. Okay, so we know what lobbying is, we know what we have to track, but now I want to talk about how to track it really quickly. And this is the part that was by far the most intimidating for me when I started, because I'm having to constantly distinguish, like, was this lobbying, was it not, was it direct, was it not, how do I track this and not get my organization audited, what do I do? And so my biggest piece of advice is just to remember that your primary focus is to just track time, organizational best practice, right? Like, I don't work in HR, but you should be kind of tracking time in general to know how your folks are spending their time. And the more specifically you can do that, the easier it will be to report your lobbying expenditures. Because I'm anxious, I will just use this moment to flag. I'm neither an attorney nor an accountant. This is not professional legal advice. But again, this is for my organization. I am kind of our gatekeeper of this C3 compliance stuff. So I'm happy to try to answer your questions. And again, if not, I will connect you to AFJ because they have all of the answers. Tracking time is really important for a lot of reasons. One, it makes this process simple, but two, it makes sure you don't forget any parts of the lobbying or the advocacy process. So Tiffany flagged a really important kind of gray area in this whole conversation, which is kind of the education and research piece. When it comes to that, the IRS cares a lot about your intentions as an organization and as an advocate. So for example, I over-report all of my time, which in general, like, if you're nowhere near your limit, it's kind of a safe thing to do. I just report all of my time as lobbying no matter what. There's no penalty for over-reporting, just because everything I do is pretty much intended to eventually be used for lobbying. And that's what the IRS cares about. If I write a report about voter ID, right? Like, I'm not just going to be doing that for, oh, in case you were curious, like, here's voter ID. Like, everyone knows, like, Civic Nebraska has a position, they're going to be lobbying this bill. That's what it was for. Now, if I were to write a report about maybe assessing the different styles of elections across the country, just so that we can kind of know the landscape, that's like genuine education. That's just for people to increase their knowledge about partisan or nonpartisan elections across the country. That I wouldn't have to report because it's genuine educational material. But when it comes to tracking time and expenses for lobbying, it's not just the activity itself. So it's not just your meeting with Senator so-and-so. It's not just the open house that you host. It includes research, it includes strategy, it includes travel time in advance of the actual activity. And again, loads of ways to create exceptions, but if you're nowhere near your limit, which is almost all of us, just report it. Be super safe.
Weston, we have two questions, if I could interrupt you for a second.
Please, absolutely.
Yeah. Would you count your research towards lobbying?
Yes.
As one. Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
And testifying on a legislative resolution is not lobbying, since an LR is not legislation, it's more education. Can you clarify? What's what?
That is a good vague area that I choose to ignore by just reporting it just to be safe. So yeah, good question. I would be careful with that because I have a hard time finding in statute something that clearly says like legislative resolutions aren't legislation. I mean, I know that they're not the same as bills. So I'll have to double check on like how you could really maneuver that. I've also heard people say, and I haven't been able to verify this on my own, I've heard some people say that testifying in front of committees doesn't count as lobbying. I have a hard time with that because it seems to fit the bill for me. So again, just to be safe, I report it. But I'll have to double check on the LB-LR distinction because you're right. It's not legislation in the same way, but it certainly is under the same bucket, and it's for a lawmaker to take a specific action. So it's close enough that I would say unless you're really trying to shave off some minutes, I would just report it to be safe. Because again, cool. There's no consequence to over-reporting as long as you're under your limit.
Awesome. Thanks.
Sure. All right. So again, another reason we track time is because it makes our final reporting very, very simple. I'm the first step in our reporting process at Civic Nebraska. I track my own time. I get timesheets basically from our voting rights team. I get timesheets even from our Collective Impact Lincoln team. I compile those. I sort them out by directing grassroots. I then give those numbers to an accountant, who then knows the hourly wage of each employee and just says, all right, so-and-so spent 25 hours lobbying. They make X number of dollars an hour. That equals blank expenditure. So hours tracked times hourly wage equals reported lobbying expenditure. As I'm sure Tiffany can attest, this is really easy when you have like one person, right, at first. So years ago, like, oh, cool, I just report my time. But when you've got 5 or 6 people who are maybe kind of doing it sometimes, the tracking gets really hard. But again, that's why if you focus on time, this will make your life much easier because you can just track this meeting took this long. And then at the end of the year, you can just do some basic multiplication and report it. Okay, great. So we have reports. We know what lobbying is. We know what our limits are. We know what we should be tracking, but then where the heck do we put that information in the first place? So who gets these reports? What do they need to know? If you're a 501c3 with paid staff who's engaging in lobbying, you're going to have 2 kinds of reports in Nebraska that you're worried about. Number 1 is annually to the IRS. I'm not going to dive into that just because, again, I'm not an accountant and that's easier to find on the internet. And there are just people more qualified than me to answer that question. But then also quarterly to the Nebraska Accountability and Disclosure Commission. So if you have paid staff engaging in lobbying, you should register them as a lobbyist. And that requires a few quarterly reports, some on behalf of the organization, some on behalf of that particular lobbyist. They take me about 5 minutes a piece. The real challenge is just remembering to do them. And the clerk's office is great. And they email me reminders. And every time I go, oh my gosh, I totally forgot. And I just do it right when I get their email. It takes about 5 minutes. I think I don't really have the time or the technology to kind of walk you through that, but especially for the NADC, if that is new and confusing to you, give me a shout and I would be happy to walk you through that. There's a really surprisingly user-friendly portal on the Nebraska legislature's website that allows us to go through all that reporting. But then finally, we have one additional layer of tracking we need to do. I saved it for the end because it's the one that gets people, and that is direct versus grassroots lobbying. It seems really simple, and I promise what's going to happen to most of you is you're going to go, oh yeah, that makes sense. That's easy. And then 2 weeks from now, you're going to sit there and you're going to be trying to decide, do I code this time as direct or as grassroots? And you're going to sit there for 20 minutes and you're not going to know why it's so hard. It's just how it happens. It's not your fault. It happens to all of us. I finally can like instinctively tell you which, but it took a very long time. So I spent a while trying to just make it as simple as possible. The IRS's language is very unhelpful. Direct lobbying is when you are doing the lobbying. That is the simplest way I can think to put it. Hey, Senator Groney, it's me, Weston. Please vote yes on LB 100. Direct lobbying. Grassroots lobbying is when I'm asking or telling or suggesting that anyone else engage in lobbying. Tiffany, oh my gosh, this bill's coming up. Please call Senator Groney. Tell him to vote no. Grassroots, because I'm not doing it. I'm asking her to do it. That is grassroots. So whether it's an individual conversation like that or whether it's kind of an advocacy blast to your email listserv, that is grassroots lobbying because you're asking someone else to engage in the lobbying. Now, to end on a complicated of a note as possible, there's another reporting requirement we have to talk about because there's another hidden limit that a little harder to find. As an organization, you can only spend up to 25% of your maximum lobbying expenditure limit on grassroots lobbying. What the heck is that? So remember at the beginning when I said the IRS doesn't care about your budget, they care about what you spend, right? So if you spend $100,000, 20% of that is your lobbying limit. So that mythical pot of money, you can now only spend a quarter of that on lobbying expenditures. On grassroots lobbying expenditures. I can only understand this through an example. So our organization now has a budget. The Citizens for, I did name it, the Citizens for Rabbit Recognition. So our total 2020 expenditures, $10,000. We're just getting started. We're doing great. We can spend 20% of our total expenditures on lobbying, right? So 10,000 times 20%, $2,000. Of that $2,000 lobbying limit, we can only spend 25% on grassroots lobbying. So 2,000 times 25%, $500. So that's the math. We have one other note, which is that you can spend $500. We can spend $500 on grassroots lobbying, even if that's the only lobbying money that we spend. Probably the most common misconception that I run into is that you have to do direct lobbying in order to increase your portion of grassroots lobbying, right? So that $2,000 is based on our overall expenditures. And then that creates, I don't know what to call it, like vacuum sealed. It creates a vacuum sealed budget of $2,000 as our lobbying limit. From that, we can spend up to $500 on grassroots. And that's okay if that's the only money that we spend. Because we said, hey, we spent $500 on grassroots. That was 25% of our limit. And that's just all that we did. That's totally okay. At least one person will be very confused by that, and it's not your fault. So please ask about that at the end and we can revisit this slide. But that's as simple as I can break it down. It's 25% of your overall limit. So I'm going to pause there for a second. We're going to stop with the logistics stuff. Let me check my time. In terms of actually doing lobbying, I walked through a couple different ways to kind of do this today. And I think most people on this call either are, well, we have a couple of experts on this call for sure. We also have a lot of folks who have, they know how to call a senator. They've done kind of the basic, like when I say engage in lobbying, like you can conceptualize like kind of how that will work. So given our definition, right, if you're talking to a lawmaker to take a specific action on specific legislation, there's like an infinite number of ways that can look. It could be an email, it could be a phone call, it could be an in-person conversation, it could be a huge event. You could surprise them in their office. Don't do that. That all counts as lobbying. So I did just want to offer kind of 3 kind of basic tips for however you decide to do this as an actual activity. There are a couple of things that I think are just good ideas no matter what. And I guess I don't think I'm qualified enough to have like a philosophy, but this is about as close as I get right here. Number 1 is be authentic, by which I mean, I have never seen any person ever, I don't care how well respected or well paid they are, I have never seen anyone accomplish anything in the legislature by trickery, by crafty political messaging, by trying to do something other than tell the truth to a lawmaker. It always backfires. It's always a bad idea. And it's just kind of gross. Don't do it. I think authenticity is so important. I understand that political messaging is a multi-billion-dollar industry, but the value of political messaging is not about your one-on-one interaction with a senator. Your senator cares about you and cares about the stories that you have to tell. And in another life, and as a side gig, I'm a writing coach, and you can summarize 12 weeks worth of work with my clients as just saying your job is to generate value in an interaction. And in this case, your value is that you're a person who has experiences and your job is to share those experiences. Certainly if you're talking to like your actual representative, then the value is doubled and tripled because you're a voter also, and that's even better. But even if it's not, your job is to be authentic and explain honestly and truthfully, here's how this would affect me. Here's why I care about this. That's the only time I've ever seen a senator truly think like, oh, maybe I should like change how I'm thinking about this. It's because they're hearing from another person and their lived experience. The second is be clear. I think I see a lot of folks, including myself, sometimes just try to do too much in a basic lobbying interaction. And that is, I think, always a mistake. It is short meetings are good, short meetings are great. And it's very important that when you leave an interaction with a legislator, they know exactly why you were having that conversation in the first place. And they have a crystal clear takeaway, whether that's from how you structure an email to how you have a long conversation. Your goal is going to be they leave going, oh, we just had an important conversation about blank. And I understand they wanted me to know blank. Super important. That is successful. I think that's I joke around here. That's my only marketable skill is I'll take this information and say, look, here's the sentence you should care about. Here's what we need to talk about. And I think that a marker for success, certainly for like a professional lobbyist, is if a senator knows for sure that a meeting request is not going to be a waste of time, that's the success in my mind. So we always want to be as crystal clear as possible. And then finally, I put be kind. Legislators are human beings and they spend a lot of their days getting yelled at and doing stressful things. And being kind is just the right thing to do, but it also is going to make you more effective. Now I put an asterisk here because I can't bring this up without, I'll make this sermon as brief as humanly possible. Obviously my organization, we are fanatically pro civil discourse. That's an essential part of what we do. We think that civil discourse is a essential part of a healthy society. What we also know for sure, though, is that demands for civility, demands for kindness, demands for meekness are very often weaponized, right, by people in power to say, oh my gosh, you yelled at me, therefore I'm going to dismiss your entire experience because you were rude. That's wrong. That's not okay. And I don't think that any of you have a moral mandate to be kind to a legislator. I'm just telling you from a practical perspective, if your goal is to actually change someone's mind, be kind. It's just an essential tactic. If a senator introduces a piece of legislation that is blatantly dehumanizing you, I'm not going to tell you to be nice about it. That's absurd. But I am telling you from a tactical perspective, that kind of kindness goes a long way and is really important. But I do have one more piece of advice that I do think is non-negotiable, and I do put some moral weight to. Respect the staff. Legislative staff are the most important and most undervalued part of this entire process. They are the institutional knowledge of the organization, especially in a world without term limits. They're human beings. And also practically, if you're rude, they can shut you out of this whole process. Any success I've had in my job is strictly because I have engaged with, asked questions of, and just respected the staff in the legislature. In fact, I've learned way more and accomplished way more because of staff than of senators. No question about it. I watch in horror every session as I see some fancy high-paid lobbyists just cruise by and disrespect and dismiss the staff. And it's just a huge mistake at every level. I also wanted to mention that I think there's a misconception that if you are calling Senator so-and-so to get a meeting and, oh, they can't meet, but you can meet with their legislative aide, that is not a bad thing. That is not a problem. That is not a defeat. I think every senator-staff relationship is different, but I think it's a safe bet to just think of the legislative aide as the brain of the office anyway, because they're the ones controlling a huge flow of information. And they're the ones who more often than not are the true subject matter experts in any given conversation. So I had to end with that because that one is, I think, non-negotiable. That being said, that was a ton of information. Thank you for listening. If you do have questions about C3 lobbying, no matter where you are kind of on the ladder of advocacy, I would be happy to help. I don't do everything right, but I do spend a lot of time thinking about this stuff, and I would be happy to, to help however I can. So there is my contact info, and I would be delighted to work on any questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Weston. I appreciate the bunnies and the levity that you give an issue that's so severe and has such gravity. So there's just two questions. If any of you have other questions, I know we're almost out of time, but we do want to make sure we address two questions that came up. One is from Jasmine Harris. For your expenditures, do you use the previous year to track? You're on mute, Weston.
Yeah, just thinking of that question. So no, I suppose I track every year is pretty much a brand new Excel sheet. Only because again, I'm only tracking time. So the value, of course, is like every year I can more specifically kind of code, I guess, my interactions and my time. So I have a better grip of what to expect. But in general, no, if I'm understanding your question, Jasmine, every year is tracked totally separately. My expenditures last year have no bearing at all on my limits or my reporting for the next year.
She clarified, she said, I mean for your lobbying limit.
How you determine how much, yeah.
Yes, okay, great question. The answer is still no, it's still year by year. So your limit will be determined by your expenditure in that exact year. So, if we spent $2 million, but then something happened and we only raised $5,000, then I'm gonna have a really small limit this year just based on what we actually spent. Great question.
Awesome. Okay, this one's for you, Tiffany. Spike from the ACLU of Nebraska said he's so impressed with the informational sheets that the Women's Fund creates on bills and issues. And, just curious how you do that and how do you approach this? Do you split the staff work on these or do you do the informational, are you the one who creates the informational sheets?
Thanks for that question, Spike. We do get a lot of love for our fact sheets on the floor of the legislature. And I will say again, this is a place where at 14 staff, we have a lot of resources and privilege and that other organizations won't have. So right now we have a public awareness team. I have a graphic designer and a communications director that help us make those. But I think the keys that I would lift up are that to be clear, right? Like Weston said, here's a hot tip about legislators. They're not reading anything. If it's more than 2 pages, they ain't reading it. So I think that is an important lesson for advocates is anything you want them to see and read, you put it on the front page and you put it on the top of the page. Be clear about what you want to tell them. They're not going to read more than 2 pages for sure. Maybe not even 1 page. So we try to make it pretty. We try to mix in stats with narrative with here's what the bill does. I usually try to include like a sort of cliff notes about what the bill does, because believe it or not, they may not have read the bill either. So I think I start it and I am way too wordy. So I have folks who help me cut down to, like Weston said, what is most important here? What do you want them to know? And then we try to incorporate colors and graphics to make it look professional and catchy and awesome. When I was a legislative staffer, so if you're a small team, right? When I was a legislative staffer, I knew the same was true of my boss. And so bullet points, bolding what is clear and what you want them to know, bold, highlight, italics, right? And I think that is a very important lesson for lots of advocates is like, we want to tell them everything. They're not going to read everything. So tell them the most important things. But yeah, it's a team effort for sure.
Awesome. Thanks, Tiffany. And then one other question from, I don't know who it just listed as an anonymous attendee. Their original question was, does meeting with the senator's staff count as lobbying if you ask for a direct action on a bill? To whoever submitted that question, I apologize. I missed senator's staff. And so Weston or Tiffany, can you clarify if meeting with the staff is considered lobbying?
Good question, Anonymous. The answer is absolutely yes. Treat senators and staff the exact same. So if you're asking for specific action on specific legislation, absolutely counts.
Awesome. That's it for our questions. If anybody else has one last burning question, please drop it into the chat. Otherwise, Lori, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Thank you so much. I know we're over time. Thank you, Weston. Thank you, Tiffany, for the wealth of information, your incredible resources that we're lucky to have reached to. So thank you so much for your information. We will be sending out slides. Is that right, Lisa? So you'll have this information if after this webinar is over, and encourage you to reach out to any of us with any additional questions you have, which you probably have many. I know I have some. Please keep an eye on the coalition's website, strongnebraska.org, so you can keep up with upcoming events and webinars. One that I did want to point out to you is if you look on the Nonprofit Association of the Midlands website, they are holding roundtables to discuss American Rescue Plan dollars. So please check that out. Those should be really good webinars to attend. And just thank you for joining us today, and have a great day. Thanks.